Hello everyone and welcome. My name's James Harding. I'm the editor and co-founder of Tortoise. Welcome to everyone who's joining us here in the warehouse in the New York Times Climate Hub. We have, if you like, a little shell of our own here for Tortoise, and we are delighted to welcome you into it and enormously grateful to the New York Times that we can do this in partnership with them. For those people who are joining us online, it's a beautiful day in Glasgow, and I'm already having the experience that I expect many people will have over the course of the next 10 days, which is a yo-yoing of feelings, an incredible concern about the scale of the problem, having done a fair bit of reading in the last few days about the scale of the problem and the pace that's needed to address it. You can't help but worry that this is going to be a huge exercise that declares victory at the end of it and then slowly is assessed as something of a disappointment. And then I sit in this room and I just look at the effort that everyone has put in, and I look at the effort that our guests have put in to come and be here, and the changes that people are engaging in inside their own companies, inside their own lifestyles, and suddenly feel this wave of optimism. And I suppose that might be the course of things in the coming hour, that we might find ourselves yo-yoing a little bit between concern about scale and pace and swinging back with optimism about determination and intent. And I want to do two things just before we get started. One is I just want to tell you what a ThinkIn is, because there are going to be a whole load of events at COP. We're trying to do something slightly different, which is we think that the wisdom is in the whole room and online, and we want to hear from as many people as possible. So we have an idea for a meeting, which is essentially to take the editorial meeting, a news meeting, and replicate it in the room, and replicate it, in fact, online. We want to hear from as many people as possible. As soon as we get started, just raise your hand. You've got something to say. I'm going to make sure I'll jot it down and start bringing you in. So we won't do the old-fashioned thing of, like, you know, hearing from Chris and Sarah and then giving you 4 minutes at the end to raise a question, which in fact is a statement. So what we'd love to do is hear what you think. And we have a loosely enforced rule, which is no questions. We actually really want to hear what you think, because as often as not, we know that that's really the part of the exchange, and want to make sure that, you know, Chris and Sarah too get the opportunity to kind of come back and respond. So let's try and have a discussion. At the end of it, I, as the editor of a news meeting, will try and at least pull together a little of what I've learned and hope that we've come to a slightly more textured understanding of what to think. And the second thing I wanted to do is say thank you. And I'm supposed to say thank you at the end, but I'm actually going to start, Sarah and Chris, by saying thank you, because this is our first ThinkIn in Glasgow. I know there've been quite a few heads of government here, but they didn't have the two of you. And we are really excited because in two different ways, it feels as though getting the chance to talk to you is a chance to really think about the scale of the problem at hand. Sarah Menke, if you've looked up online a little bit about Grow Intelligence, as well as thinking that you've probably got the coolest website around with the best tagline, which is what on earth is really going on, which is the thing that we all really want to understand. It also has these fantastic kind of questions about it, which is, you know, are Chinese people buying more pork? Is there more corn being grown than soy? And you feel as though the way you're approaching the data here, Sarah, gives us a granular understanding of this complex ecosystem we're trying to wrap our heads around. So we're really grateful to you to be here, and know that you kind of prolong your stay just to be here, so thank you. And Chris Kempczynski, I sort of find myself thinking that you could just spend a week trying to understand what's happening in McDonald's, because I try to look up some of the numbers around the people that you serve every day. And actually, even if you look online, what's amazing is that number keeps growing. The latest one I had was knocking on 70 million people every day, 100 countries around the world. So if there is one business that can help us understand the question in front of us, you know, the chain of command question, business and government, suppliers and customers, how do we all get to net zero? I expect that McDonald's is it. So to have the co-founder of Grow Intelligence, the chief executive of McDonald's, feels like a real treat. I'm going to start, if I might, by coming to you each with just a sort of big picture question. And it's about my kind of yo-yoing between despair and optimism. Sarah, do you think that on the fundamental issue of the data, we have a sufficiently granular understanding of the problem we face? And if not, how would you describe it to us?
We have the data we need to have a sufficient understanding. Whether we want to have that understanding or not, different question. But you mentioned our tagline, "What on earth is going on?" And the reason we ended up coming up with that tagline is when I first started Grow Intelligence, the reasoning behind it was sort of a desire to fix our food systems and to address things like food security, which have been being discussed in sort of conferences and meetings and sort of within society since the 1970s. And we've been saying we have the will, we have the way to solve for food security. And what I had realized when I was in my past life, I was an oil and gas trader where data fueled the markets. I had realized that we had not done the very basic thing around understanding our food systems, which is a very complex real world system, but is sort of a mapping out of every piece of information there is out there about every agricultural product on earth to be able to monitor the supply and the demand of every product around the world every single day. And without sort of that type of information architecture, we can't change the system to be what we want it to be, right? So that's really where we set out, what we set out to do. And what became really interesting is that if you want to understand the supply of agriculture, you need to understand our earth. You need to understand the environment. You need to understand the soil, the climate, etc. If you want to understand demand, you need to understand humans and humanity, because the demand is about people and it's about economics. And so it very quickly became this massive platform that was ingesting tons and tons of data on sort of our climate and our environment, and we'd built sort of the world's largest database around that, and our economies. And this sort of tension between ecological preservation and economic growth is what's driving so much about what we're talking about today, right? This tension is very real, and sort of conversations around developing economies today, which is, the carbon footprint of sub-Saharan Africa is very low, but the consequences it will face as we transition to sort of a lower carbon footprint are going to be very high. Who pays for that, right? So these tensions become real. So this platform became much bigger than an agricultural platform. It became this platform that started telling us about what on earth is going on. And what that tells me is that we have more than enough data, but what we lack is the commitment to sort of have the right standards, to speak the same language, and then take action. And taking action, it involves, taking risks, and it involves transferring those risks, but you need a common understanding to be able to do that.
And how much do you worry? I mean, even now, just at the beginning of COP, you're aware of this suspicion that companies are coming here, businesses coming here, saying, we're all on board, but heaven knows this is complicated. And that complexity itself becomes a brake. Complexity becomes an excuse for caution. How do you take all of that complex range of data and say, no, it's an argument for action?
Yeah, I mean, the raw data is complex, but what sort of machine learning and AI have let us do is, one, organize it, right? So the first part of it is like, it's super fragmented, it's all over the place. Great, we have solutions for that. It's called creating a graph, and it's called a knowledge graph in technical terms, but you map that knowledge. And AI plays a big role in sort of mapping and standardizing that. Then the second is then saying, okay, now that we have this, what insights do we want to generate? And so people just need to interact with the insights to be able to take action, and to sort of act off the insights, they need to be able to trust you, right? So this notion of sort of honesty and transparency, I think, is something that sort of is lacking in the technology industry today. So you don't hear people talking about honest answers, but as a company, that's what we've been spending a lot of our time on, is like, we give you the confidence that we'll give you the honest answer. It doesn't have to be perfect. And in fact, most predictive modeling is not. But if you're honest about how you got there, again, it becomes the basis for a conversation. And so sort of that complexity it exists in the background, but we don't have to make that our problem anymore. We sort of have to trust the outputs that drive the decision making.
Chris, can I ask you, it feels as though, the things that Sarah's touching on there, the way businesses operate, the way supply chains and the impact on the earth, customers, our demand, they're all in your line of sight.
Yep.
And I just wondered, when you think about it, just from the very basics, when you think about McDonald's and net zero, how do you organize your thinking within the business, footprint on the earth, impact and nudge to customers?
Yep. Well, I think when we think about it end to end. So it's not just what happens in the restaurant. We think about it all the way out through the supply chain. So it is a holistic look at it. And for us, I mean, the way that we think about it is we buy about $40 billion a year worth of food and paper in our restaurants. And if you think about what we're able to do with that buying power, we work with some of the biggest food suppliers in the world. And so what we choose to set around standards for how we source food, our expectations, drives innovation in the suppliers, but that innovation then cascades through the whole food chain. You need the big players like a McDonald's to drive the innovation that goes through the supply chain that then picks up a lot of the smaller suppliers along the way. So for us, we think regardless of whether you eat at McDonald's or not, what McDonald's is able to do using our size is something that will impact everybody who is benefiting from the food supply chain. I think for us, as you think about it, we have a team, Jenny McCullough is here, right here in our front row, who leads this effort. And it is getting back to this data, getting very granular about every single aspect of what we do and the way that it impacts the earth. And then starting to develop discrete strategies, either on our own or with our suppliers, of every single one of those. How do you start to make progress on it? And so for us, there are, on the one hand, it can be an overwhelming problem. On the other hand, I think we've shown you can make progress on it as well. And it's going to take time, but for us, we're committed to the net zero by 2050 commitment. And I think, with the suppliers that we're working on, many of them have made similar commitments. So I think it is possible.
So Chris, maybe I'll come to you, Jen, in a moment, if I might. But Chris, I suppose an element of this is also philosophical, because I know that since you've taken over, you have kind of said, okay, sign up to that accelerated ambition for net zero. There's quite a lot of data that you can see in terms of what McDonald's itself has done. When you talk about suppliers, and I think that's a really colossal point, is how much can McDonald's be responsible for the behavior of companies that it works with? And how much do you want to take on that responsibility? And if you do, how do you then police it?
Yeah. Well, I think it goes back to, we have the power of the purse. And the power of the purse is, for us, essentially, we decide who we source from. And we set the standards for what our expectations are from our suppliers. And suppliers that aren't able to meet our standards, we go and find a new set of suppliers. So I think, I would say we have all the choice in the world as to who we're partnering with. And fortunately for us, this hasn't been a tough sell with our suppliers. Our suppliers have been very themselves invested in getting after this. We have about 100 different suppliers. 80% of them plus have already come forward with all of their own climate disclosure reporting. Many of them have already made their own commitments around net zero. So this wasn't for us a hard ask. I think, anybody whose business relies on a healthy planet, which inherently agriculture does, is probably more attuned to the challenges and the risks of climate change than almost any other industry. So I think there's a natural incentive for us to get after this. But ultimately for us, it's about using our purchasing power to drive the right set of behaviors.
And what do you think? Let's get stuck into the question of meat for a moment, right? Because the reason I'm looking down, Chris, there's just a torrent of comments about, firstly, things you've said, Sarah, around the use of data, but then there's a lot of questions which are around how do we drive and how much is it for example, McDonald's' responsibility to drive changes in customer behavior and expectation. And a starting point, what's your view on meat?
Yeah. So I think for us, meat is, whether it's beef, chicken, fish, it is an important source of protein. It has been what has fed humans for millennia, and will continue to be something that's an important source of nutrition for populations. And so for us, as we've thought about it, we don't try to tell a customer what they should or shouldn't do. What we try to do is make whatever the customer's looking for, we try to be transparent about it and the consequences of that. But we also try our best to make sure that we are offsetting the impact of that. And so beef is an obvious one that we get asked all the time about the impact of beef. Part of it is, how realistic is it to think that you're going to be able to move the entire planet off of beef? Our point of view would be, that's a pretty heavy lift. It's an easier lift in our mind to how do you get beef production to be more sustainable, to have a lower environmental impact. That's an easier idea to get after than saying we're going to get 7 billion people or some subset of that to not eat beef in the next 20, 30 years. That feels like a bridge too far.
I'm going to come to you 1 second, Ms. Sarah, because I know that we tend to often have a conversation about this in the place where we live and possibly don't see it globally. But can I just press you on one thing, Chris, which is when you say we don't want to tell our customers what to do or not, right? I get that if you were really being kind of didactic, if you had your hands on your hips and telling people what to do. But actually, the story of McDonald's, and certainly the story that McDonald's has told of itself in the last decade or so, has been of a company that really does direct customers towards different kind of portion sizes, different kinds of food contents with an eye to health.
Yeah.
And so the question is, without telling customers what to do, McDonald's does have the power to direct a really substantial change in diet.
Yeah.
And so how do you take that responsibility?
Well, it starts with offering choice. So in our menu, we have everything from, more indulgent foods to healthier foods that you could order. So choice for us is one of the things that's an important part of this. In the UK, as an example, and I see Alistair McCrow, who is our MD for the UK here, they've introduced onto their menu plant-based burger, and that's in the process of being rolled out. Whether we expand and do more plant-based on our menu is going to be up to whether the customer buys the plant-based product. If the customer buys the plant-based product, we'll have more plant-based on the menu. I think where we do have influence, and you're fair to point this out, is, we can create nudges. The behavioral economists often talk about nudges. One of the things that we've done with plant-based, the products today are higher cost than a conventional protein. So a plant-based burger is a higher cost burger than a beef-based burger. But what we've done is we've actually absorbed the margin impact on that. So we've created a situation where you don't have to make that trade-off based on cost, because we're providing sort of a level playing field. That's an area where we can do a nudge that lets the consumer make that choice without having to think about, well, geez, that's the more expensive choice. Do I want to go do that? Now, whether the customer ultimately says, well, you know what, I'm going to still order the Quarter Pounder or the Big Mac. Okay, again, we've given them the choice.
But that itself is a big decision.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get some perspective on this, because I'm slightly worried that one of the worries too about COP is that you're essentially involved in, if you like, a developed economy argument with itself. When you look, Sarah, at global meat consumption and global expectations of meat consumption, i.e. 5 to 10 years, where do you think this meat plant-based protein conversation lands?
It lands in this room.
Well, I'm going to come some people in a moment because I've seen some hands. Yeah.
It's, I think that is the dilemma, right? So if you take sub-Saharan Africa just as a whole, median age is 17 and a half years old. And so it's quite a young population. The per capita meat consumption there is about 1/40th of the per capita meat consumption in the US. And so what you're like, so this idea that we're transitioning off of meat, where you have literally societies where there's barely any meat consumption, and this is sort of the youngest parts of the world, you have it, but even take China, I mean, which is not as far, but China is the world's largest pork consumer on a per capita basis and on an outright basis. But on a per capita basis, its beef consumption is nothing compared to the US. It's maybe like 1/4, right? A quarter, less than a quarter. And so you have where you're gonna lose sort of consumption and have a move into sort of alternative proteins in some parts of the world, the growth we'll experience in demand in other parts of the world will more than sort of make up for that transition that occurs elsewhere, right? And so the thing that sort of worries me sometimes about these conversations is I call them, they're like first world privileged conversations we're having, when in sort of many parts of the world we're talking about still, you know, people having their first burger ever. And so you know, and you need all of this. That's why you actually do need transitions to occur, because Americans eat way too much meat. But that doesn't, and by the way, it's growing. So that's the other thing, which is, as we've sort of seen sort of a proliferation of alternative proteins occurring in sort of the global markets, the assumption has been that per capita consumption of traditional proteins has dropped. It has not. One of the most shocking graphs that you'll see is the per capita consumption of chicken, pork, and beef has been growing.
Everywhere.
Everywhere. And what I say is that if you zip code adjust it, you then see a drop in wealthier cities, in wealthier zip codes. Why? Cost, right? And so there is
Sorry, a drop in meat consumption.
Yeah, because they're because it's actually still quite expensive to consume them sort of at home, right? And so barring margin-based choices that Chris just talked about, with McDonald's making that in sort of making that decision on sort of plant-based burgers, the economics don't work for most people. So I think, and this is why I'm saying this trade-off between economic growth, ecological preservation is real. And people paying for it are the people who least afford it. And so we got to sort of balance it out to say, how do we change what we feed our cattle, so that if we can sort of accept that, okay, even if we all in this room stop eating meat, there's going to be others that are going to consume it. And so
okay, so I'm having a yo-yo moment, right? Which is actually, I listen to Chris and I think, oh, that's really quite a thing. If you price a plant-based burger the same as a beef burger, actually we will find out whether or not people eat them, and you've taken cost out of the equation. That's potentially quite a big nudge, right? Then I listen to you and I think, oh dear, you know, there could be around food what I think of as kind of the China syndrome around energy. That people think, look, China's consumption of energy is going to be so huge, it doesn't matter what we do here, that, you know, we're never going to get to net zero given Chinese energy demand. It could be that on food, you know, protein consumption with rising demographics in Africa mean that any changes in dietary behavior in developed economies are going to be way more than offset by uptake in Africa. And that just encourages everyone to say, well, look, there's nothing much we can do about this.
I don't want to be that dire.
It's a little emotional.
But yeah, you when you think of it that way, it can come across as that. But I think these nudges do make a difference, meaning that what you can have is that per capita consumption in Africa and Asia and Southeast Asia, et cetera, might never reach the levels that we reached in places like the United States, right? So you create inherent caps, right? It's sort of like, because as that transition happens elsewhere in the world, dietary shifts start to have ripple effects globally. It takes time. It doesn't mean that the consumption is going away, but what it probably means is that as you achieve scale, by the way, cost does go down, right? So if there is more demand, the higher the demand, the lower the price gets. Demand will drive sort of the price parity that we need. And by the way, this is completely different sort of industry, but in the energy industry, for the longest time, the argument for having coal-fired generation in the US was that it was the cheapest.
Yep.
Until you had the shale oil and shale gas revolution, which drove down natural gas prices so much. You went from $15 an MMBTU to $2.50 an MMBTU. It naturally priced coal out of the system. And so I think you'll have shifts like that happening where market forces will make that occur. And when that occurs, then you can sort of have scale. So it's not as dire. It's just, let's be realistic as to where things are going when, and plan accordingly.
So I'm gonna start bringing some people in if I might, Chris,
Sure.
and I'm gonna do something unfair to you, Jen, which is actually before we got started, we're talking a little bit about how this is difficult, right? Some of the things I looked at the data from McDonald's, actually you talk about kind of reduction in emissions, even against the 2015 target, a couple of years, but I think it's like 8.5%. But that still leaves a long way to go. And so I wonder, will you tell us a little bit about the stubborn problems for an organization of that size, given sort of this is your remit in the business?
What I would say, hi everyone, is I think one of the biggest challenges of this conversation is there's no silver bullet. There's no one solution that can solve the entire challenges that we face in serving food and in supporting farming communities around the world. And so there's that complexity and scope challenge of how do we get all of our partners, both franchisees and suppliers, whatever commodities and food ingredients they're producing, on the journey and moving forward. So that's one piece. The other piece, I think, is understanding different incentives and producers. We've talked a lot today about different choices on the consumer side and different proteins. But I also think it's important to talk about the opportunities and how we work with our farming and ranching communities towards the food production systems that we want to drive more of, and creating that demand for the type of more sustainable protein production that we're all working towards. And so, I think it's very important that we recognize the consumer side of the conversation, and then also look at what opportunities we have to drive resiliency among our farming communities, how we can show that more regenerative grazing practices, in the case of beef cattle, can also help increase biodiversity and resiliency to climate shocks on their farms, how that can be a more economically productive farm, in addition to the benefits for nature and the benefits for the climate that we see. And so I do think that framing is a challenge that we have, but it's also a real opportunity of this is about all of our collective future, all of our collective success, and really helping to bring along the populations, that it's easy for people to sit in the room and say, we should do this or we should do that, but making sure that we create that context of that we're in this together, that we're partnering on this journey, and that it's ultimately good for all of us as well as for the planet at large.
Jen, thank you. I'm going to try and bring in, there are a couple of people who've made interesting points. One is actually in response to your point, Sarah, about kind of leapfrog, which Maggie Hobbs made. I'd like to bring in Maggie, but Linda Hausman made a point about customer behavior and whether or not we need a wholesale change. So I'm going to hope to hear from Linda Hausman in a second. So I'm going to ask my colleague Colin to bring them up. But I see Patrick Holden from Sustainable Food Trust. You caught my eye. Patrick, what's on your mind?
Well, shall I stand up?
You will stand up or sit down. Those geniuses with the cameras will catch you either way.
Well, I just like to say that I think that although big food companies and caterers have been part of the problem, I absolutely think that if we're going to reach net zero with agriculture in the time we've got available, they have to be part of the solution. So, and I already know, because I know Beth Hart, who's sitting in front of me, that in the UK, McDonald's have done a lot towards moving towards more regenerative and sustainable production. But I agree with you, Chris, that I think that moving towards sustainable beef production is absolutely the key to this. I'm a good friend of Eric Schlosser, who wrote Fast Food Nation, And at the beginning of that film, which some of you may have seen, called Food Inc., there's a shot of Eric eating a burger. And he says, I like to have a burger. And then he goes into the story behind it, which is not too good. And I like a burger too. And I guess here's, because I like to think of myself as a kind of focus group of one, because I know, not because I'm special, but because I know a lot. Here's my suggested route map towards a sustainable burger. I think moving towards grass-fed, preferably avoiding grain finishing in feedlots. I'm not against anything. I'm a dairy farmer myself. I feed grain to my cows, but not too much. And I think the cows need to stay near the farms where they were born, if possible. And to achieve that, you need to regionalize slaughtering and processing facilities. And that is a massive infrastructure change. And I think if you did that, and you move towards regenerative farming systems, which really means moving away from nitrogen use on the grasslands, it would be possible to produce a burger that I would want to eat, because I love burgers. And I think it's more important, the most important challenge you face is not just to mimic this great rush towards plant-based everything, but actually to get the burger right and the beef production right. And I think you made a very good start in the United Kingdom. I don't know so much about what you're doing in the US, but I believe it's possible.
Chris, do you want to sort of respond? You've got not even a digital thumbs up, which I know is very 2020, but an actual one. So I'll come to you, but there's a one at the back. I'm going to come to you in a moment. But Chris, do you want to respond?
Well,
to
I
that?
think that's exactly right. I mean, that, there are ways to do it. Part of it is getting the infrastructure set up to be able to accommodate it. But we know, regenerative grazing, we've got a number of tests going on. We know that you can get the grassland that is the rancher's property, that itself can act as a carbon sink. And so there are offsets that naturally exist within cattle ranching that can be part of getting this to solution. Now, the challenge is to do it at scale, to do it not just in a place here or a place there, but to do it in a massive way. So I think that's where we try to get in and be helpful. I think, though, the other thing that we haven't talked about here a little bit or at all, but I think it's an important thing is, the Freerider problem is a significant problem on this.
What do you mean?
Freerider is, a lot of times I am asked, well, what if McDonald's could just do this, wouldn't that solve the problem? And I'll give you an example. We several years ago went to eliminating styrofoam in all of our restaurants, and obvious reasons why we did that. Turns out in many parts of the world, styrofoam is a preferred packaging solution. And so we had a situation where our competitors in some locations were saying, hey, we have styrofoam cups now,
Right.
when we got out of it. And so, that's an example of a Freerider problem where we are trying to lead the example, but then someone else in the industry can use it and be opportunistic. And so how do we have a policy framework that can address some of this Freerider issue? How do you have a policy framework that deals with these negative externalities that, I think getting to pricing around carbon is an obvious mechanism for us to go do that. Cap and trade could be another way, but those are the types of things done in combination with private industry that are going to be the solution. McDonald's can't solve it alone, but neither can the government. We have to work in combination on both of them.
I find the styrofoam cup thing really interesting, because presumably one of the issues you've got is that in different markets in the world, not only the appetites are different, but the appetites for this in terms of pace of change.
Yeah.
And forgive me, I should know this, but what's the system that you've got? Is sort of every country moves at its own pace, or it's sort of
in that case,
globally?
we mandated it globally. I think another one, and just to try to make it really practical and this is a little bit less on carbon, but it still goes to the environment, which is, what do we do about straws? We have something like 29-30 million straws a day used in our restaurant. We could go to a paper-based straw that would be about 10 times more expensive and doesn't work as well. So Do we do that? And potentially, those are the types of practical things that we try to think about. And so we have a number of markets where in those cases we say, we'll let you decide. So we're not going to mandate that everybody has to go to it. But if you think your customer is ready for it, then you can pull that packaging solution down. So today, any market around the world could pull down, if they wanted to, a paper straw. Only a few markets around the world do it. But boy, if it got legislated that everybody had to offer paper straws, we'd be in the catbird seat on that because we've already got the supply set up. So those are the things at sort of the nitty-gritty level that we end up having these internal debates about at McDonald's, of how far do we go on our own before we have confidence that others will follow with us.
Well, I really love Patrick's focus group of one. So I'd just like to say, alongside his love of the burger, I have strong feelings about the chocolate milkshake. So
okay.
I will follow the debate about straws very closely. Patrick, sorry, I'm just really aware of time, so I want to make sure we get to it. And hopefully we'll have time to catch up in person after the end of the thinking. There are two hands at the back. Before I come to you, member, can I just bring in one person, Maggie Hobbs, who raised a point in response to your comments around Africa and protein consumption. Maggie's joined us online. Maggie, you there? Hello there.
Hi. Just my point is that a little bit around what Sarah's saying around kind of very Western views, and the problems haven't actually occurred in Africa yet. So we've got such an opportunity to bring in the voices of the demographic dividend that we're going to get of the young generation. I live in Kenya, to bring people in. So I think it was more around not being in the yo-yo that you're talking about, James, is to understand that there's hope and opportunity in the young people of Africa, and let's make sure that we bring their voices into these debates, because actually lots of the issues about meat eating and other things that we're beating ourselves up about in the West haven't actually happened yet in Africa.
Sorry, I'm just interested to know whether you feel as though we are having the conversation, which is, as you say, kind of rich people's problems, that, and also generational, that it's, if you like, it's a rich and old conversation.
I'm young.
I'd like to think so, but I'm not. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, no, listen, I think having multiple voices and different voices and perspectives in the room is important, to the point of sort of, are these debates occurring in places like Kenya just yet? No, not really, because we're still sort of, like I said, it's still sort of in the early stages. We have an office in Nairobi. Our biggest expense in the office is milk. Right. And the amount of milk that is consumed, because that's sort of the sort of another form of consumption, but literally the average Kenyan drinks a liter of milk.
A what day?
In our office, yes.
Wow. Okay, well, listen, given I grew up in newsrooms where we more problem with a different kind of drink, I think that's a problem you might wish to have. Let me take, if I can, there's a woman in the back. So will you just introduce yourself? So I can't see.
Hi, I'm Tara McCarthy from Ireland, from Dublin. I'm working with the Irish Food Board. I suppose what I'd like to chat is a little bit to build on the point there of grass-fed beef and the work that McDonald's are already doing in that space as well. I guess the line of questioning I'd probably challenge in that so much of this has been, what is McDonald's doing? What is McDonald's doing? Whereas I was at a session downstairs earlier on, and they were talking about, as a species, we work as in hives, that we really don't survive on our own. And what I'd perhaps like to put forward is the idea that it's coalitions of the willing actually create change, rather than this demand, McDonald's must do it. And I think that the way McDonald's have approached this coalition of the willing approach is very, very evident in their work in the UK and Ireland, in that they've created roundtables. They have looked to work in partnership with the supply chain. They become members of different initiatives, rather than, I guess, to use Chris's own words, just to use the power of the purse. Because I think this is very, very complex. And I guess to Sarah's point earlier on, the challenge I'd give on, there is the data sets, we know what's happening. The regionality of food production makes that much, much more complex. Because if I'm looking at farms in Ireland, for example, and we're a very, very small country by any of the examples we're giving, but a farm working in Connemara versus a farm working in Meath are actually fundamentally different. So the detail behind the data sets that are required on family farms makes this issue, as I guess, less scalable, less quickly than many people might say. AI will sort it all. So I suppose the key point that I'd like to make is that regenerative, from our perspective, is a huge, huge win if we're looking at working in partnership with our farmers, with our supply chain. And I would probably compliment McDonald's on the work that they've done so far with regard to believing in flagships, believing in speaking to farmers, and actually bringing that to the table as much as possible as a solution rather than as I guess, a power hit that they could have done.
Tara, thank you. There's a gentleman just to the side of you, if you pass the mic. And Chris, if you wait 1 second, I just want to get another comment. Oh, there's someone
Hi,
behind.
sorry,
And then I'll come to you, sir, in glasses.
We had
Yes.
to share the mic.
Okay, good.
Maria Smith, Bureau Happold. I was reflecting on what Chris was saying about sort of the power of the purse, and it made me think actually there's a clue in that, which is, you know, the speed at which we need to address climate change means that we really do need to work with the kind of incumbent seats of power, and whether you agree or not, McDonald's does have a huge, huge amount of power, huge resources, infrastructure, international networks, and so on. And so I was just wondering, I know we're not allowed to ask questions, so maybe it's just a request that you take this back to your next meeting, right? But that, you know, if we approach this from the perspective of like, okay, what can we do? What resources do we have? What kind of power and that can we mobilize? Can we leverage to address the climate crisis? There's a huge amount that you could do. So how could you sort of take that, rather than necessarily thinking about like, okay, how do we make McDonald's or beef burgers or anything kind of more sustainable? How do we just use what we have in order to bring about the best and fairest transition that we possibly could? What power is there in that?
Chris, do you want to respond to those 2 points? If you would just pass the mic to the gentleman, and I'll come to the front, and you, man, in a second.
Yeah, well, I think, I mean, part of why we're here is addresses those 2 points. Part of why McDonald's is here at COP26 is because we do believe in coalition building, and we believe that, you know, we have a role to play along with many of the other attendees here. So I think that's been our approach to, you know, a number of issues, and it's no different than that. I think for the same point, you know, we're here not just talking about it as a restaurant company, but I'm here talking about it as, you know, a CEO, but also a parent and someone who cares about the community. And so for us, this is the more we can bring attention to it. I think that's been one of the things that we have an opportunity as McDonald's to do is when we talk about something, it tends to get attention. And I think just raising the level of awareness of this issue globally is an area that we think, you know, we have an ability to do. 80% of the population in the markets that we operate in typically will visit a McDonald's at least once a year. If we can make those people aware of what we're doing and the importance of climate change, that can be our contribution that goes beyond whether we have a grass-fed burger or not, which I agree would be delicious as well. So,
Chris, can I just make a point? There would be some climate activists who would worry that even taking on board Tara's point about convening and coalitions that are willing, and Maria's point about the corporate power, is that it's not enough.
yeah.
That you guys, even with the best will in the world, are not enough, and that I wonder how much you worry about that, and how you effectively deliver what I suppose you were nudging towards, which is you're going to have to get some rules set by government now in order to make sure that there's industry-wide change.
I totally agree. We will not get there. I don't think any of the companies that have made a net zero pledge are going to get there if it is completely on private industry to go do it. And I would just point out, we run 40,000 restaurants around the world. Those restaurants require power to go run those restaurants. We have 4,500 restaurants in China. To the degree the electrical grid is not built with just renewable resources, now you have a challenge of how are you going to offset that? And I think for us, you know, there's only so much we can do. We do ride on the infrastructure of the countries where we operate, and to the degree that the infrastructure is not climate ready, climate resilient, or net zero, it's going to affect what we can do. We can't build our own electrical grid. And so those are the things that I completely agree. Without government stepping up on this, we'll make progress, but we won't make as much progress as we need to.
I'm going to come in a moment to Damien Crowe, who's online. You won't have seen, was raised some points about tech, how much tech is going to help us get from here to there. But there are a number of people here. There's you, sir, the glasses, Ed in the front, and the woman at the back. So I'm going to take all those 3 points if I might. So,
me first?
Yes, please.
Thanks, James. Alistair McLeod.
Oh, hello.
How you going? Nice to see you. Thanks for having me. I'd like to just bring the conversation back to meat, because I'm a hands up. I'm a beef producer from Australia, and I'm very frustrated by the conversation that says that all animal protein is bad and all plant protein is good. It's wrong, and we need to start changing the dialogue to say that quite a lot of animal protein is really good. And I'm very pleased, Jen, for you to talk that you were talking about regeneratively produced beef. We're now producing beef in Australia that is sequestering carbon as it grazes. We've documented that as an end of carbon credit to demonstrate that we can actually produce massively carbon positive beef. Our estimate is that if we can get 10% of Australian farmland converted to regenerative production, we can offset about 100 million tons of carbon a year. That's about 20% of Australia's annual emissions. It's one of the reasons why Australia has targeted soil carbon as one of its key decarbonisation strategies. There is an enormous opportunity here to demonstrate that meat is good, so long as it's produced the right way.
And Alex, can you just tell us, is it much more expensive?
No. We're actually producing beef much more cheaply now because we're not using inputs, we're not using chemicals. We are actually making more money producing low carbon beef than we were producing high carbon beef. The economics are much better. Lastly, we are about to launch, through our foundation in Australia, we're about to launch a research program to move the dial so that we can get many more producers producing regenerative beef, regenerative wool, regenerative cotton, regenerative whatever it is you like. We want the whole industry in Australia to be involved with this. We'd love McDonald's to be involved with it as well. So maybe we should talk.
Alistair, thank you. And I'm going to sorry to come back on the kind of bigger picture of you in a moment, Chris, but Woody, there's just a couple of, yes, you've got your hand gingerly up, but yes. Kieran, just put, sorry, Ed, take it and then I'll come to you in a moment, yes.
Thank you. It's just been such an important conversation, and really,
just introduce yourself.
Edward Davey, WRI, Food and Land Use Coalition. This conversation is just so incredibly important, and you would want it really in the plenary of the Glasgow conference. And I think we have got a chance to take food into COP over the next 10 days. Just two observations, if I may, and agreeing with dear friends in the audience that regenerative agriculture is a wonderful thing to which we should all aspire. I also think from the point of view of climate science, it's also unquestionably the case that many of the world's people, particularly in the West, do need to eat significantly less red meat. They should eat red meat that's been well produced. I completely agree with Alistair and Patrick, but from the climate point of view, I also think it's unquestionable that there needs to be a very significant reduction. And if you follow that line of argument, then I think McDonald's has an enormous moral responsibility to broker that and signal that even more than you've already begun to do, and at the same time celebrating the embrace of regenerative practices that you have followed. That's my first point. And then my second point is about the actual resilience of the global food system if the climate continues to change at the pace that's currently due to, in part driven by agriculture and land use change. And it's really a question for Sarah, who we celebrate as a FOLO ambassador. How resilient is the current global food model to the changing climate that we foresee, unless there are the kinds of significant reductions in emissions that Glasgow intends to deliver?
Okay, well, Ed, you've broken the rule on questions, but you get away with it because it's such a good question. So I'm going to put that sorry in a second. But just at the back there, have you got a microphone? Would you just pass? We'll just put. Thank you so much. Oh, and so I did say I'm coming to you. I promise you I will. Yes.
I guess I wanted to come back to the
So could you
question.
just say your name?
Oh, sorry. Sheila Bonini from World Wildlife Fund. And as context, we've been working with McDonald's for over 10 years, collaborating on reducing the impact of their supply chain, plastics, and many other areas that we work together. But I did want to come back to the important point about collaboration, because it is true that one company can't do it by itself. And it's true that even when you do, right, you've got others, you know, you can make huge difference. I do think, though, the importance, and one of the reasons we work with McDonald's and other companies like McDonald's, is the importance of scale. And I think when you think about scale, you think about you're doing something with your suppliers. Your suppliers are not just your suppliers. They're suppliers of others as well. And so when you're driving that change, but I think the other piece of it that maybe you didn't talk about, Chris, when you were speaking, but is also the importance of driving that change in others, and the importance of convening and bringing together that collaboration. And I think through many different commodities, we've seen that with roundtables and otherwise. And I do think that McDonald's has a huge role, which they are playing in doing that. And I think the other piece, which is bringing your scale, is your voice and the power of your voice. We talked a bit about it with consumers, but I think also that voice in trying to drive for and ask our leaders for policy, and being in a place today like in Glasgow around COP and saying we need policy around climate change, I think is really important. So leveraging your scale in many ways, just a huge asset that you have that you can bring to the table for all of us.
Shiva, thank you very much. Bonnie, will you just do the favor? I'm going to hold you for one more second. There's some poor person who's been extremely patient in the glasses, so I'm going to come to you, sir.
Hi there. Thanks, James. I'm Duncan Gray, founder of a responsible business consultancy called Brody. I'm just struck by the title of Chain of Command and thinking about chain of care. And I'm struck by, Sarah, you're giving us wonderful data and I'm loving it. But I'm reflecting on, say, Rio Tinto's experience last year where they lost their CEO because they didn't pay enough attention to the sacred, the specific, the special. And I'm wondering where data leads us that from a people perspective. And Chris, I'm reflecting on the transition that's coming and how you take farmers and people with you on that transition, because it's not just about the carbon data, it's rich. And so just that reflection about chain of care and thinking about that.
So I didn't hear your name.
Duncan.
Duncan, okay. I love the expression, the chain of care. We'll retitle the next comment. Are there so many hands? I'm also aware of time running out, so I fear we're going to have that conversation. Actually, do because I'm waiting to the lady right next to you. Sorry, I'm. By the way, I know I said it to get you out on time. Paul, sorry, I have to get away. So yes, sorry, ma'am.
Yes, hi, I'm Louise Wilson from Abundance Investment. I just, it's Finance Day today at COP. And I just, wanted to reflect on the fact that, McDonald's, your business model is presumably to sell more burgers and more chocolate milkshakes. I love the discussion that's being had here, but actually, at the end of the day, it's your shareholders that will judge you. I hope that you take this conversation back to them, because there is an inherent risk in your business model of not fixing these really key problems. But shareholders, I assume, must be on board with what you're doing and in fact pushing you. So I assume those conversations are happening, and if they're not, today is a really good day to bring it front and center.
Louise, thank you. So it's a great note to invite you, Chris, to respond, and then you, Sarah. Chris, do you want to respond to that, to the investors' point, but also to the points that we heard about a fundamental change in farming?
Well, I think one of the things that we do is about disclosure. So we publish a report every year that shows the progress against the commitments that we made. We made commitments to bring our greenhouse gases down in line with the Paris Treaty or Paris Agreement. We've similarly made commitments around sustainable sourcing. And so we then use this report card that we publish every year for anybody who's interested to go and see how we're progressing on that. In our proxy statement that we file every year, we typically list the risk to the business, and one of the risks that we talk about in our proxy statement is the risk of being able to continue to source the impact of climate change, et cetera. And then lastly, we do have about 10% of our investor base would be what I would call sort of an ESG oriented fund. And so with those investors in particular who have ESG as part of their investing remit, as you would imagine, we have pretty robust dialogue with them about where we're progressing, where we're focusing on things. And I think that number is only going to grow over time. So it is out there. It is something that certainly a good number of investors care about. And part of what we try to do is just hold ourselves accountable by disclosure.
Chris, thank you. So do you want to finish up, and particularly with the point that Ed made about resilience, because we haven't really touched at all upon that.
I'm actually going to tie disclosure and resilience into one because I have a lot of views on disclosure. So, I mean, and Chris has touched upon sort of certain things needing to come from government and the role of government, which is actually regulation to some extent, right? It's a word most of us don't like, but it's necessary, and it's necessary sort of for a reason. And so I think when it comes to financed in and disclosure, I think one of the fundamental flaws in sort of ESG investing is that it's not really consistent in any way. I say everybody, it's a lens, not an asset class, and everybody's wearing different glasses. So first, we need to convert it into a set of standards that then let us compare company A to company B. Right now, how investors are doing that and how financial markets are resolving it is actually, I call it voodoo. But we have data that actually helps us to create these standards, and regulators are increasingly playing a role in saying, this is what we want to see, this is what we expect to see, because companies then are actually pretty good at following rules, right? And so the sort of analogy I give is during the last financial crisis in 08, 09, all these capital adequacy ratios and requirements came about for banks. And the Fed went to the banks and said, you need to conduct stress tests. And the banks are like, okay, like what is a stress test? Because everybody was conducting their own form of a stress test until the Fed went and said, here's what you need to do. And everybody said, okay, great. I got my marching orders. Let me build out my structures to be able to sort of do that, et cetera. We kind of need that today in sort of the climate world, right? And regulators are starting to explore that more than ever before. Europe is ahead of the US. But in the US, you actually have the likes of the SEC now, to your point of disclosures, going to companies who have been disclosing on a voluntary basis, saying, you're disclosing this. What does this mean? How does this match up relative to your sustainability reports so that we can be more prescriptive about what you should report? That then will allow us to actually measure companies on a consistent basis and then measure them for not just their carbon, but their climate, and sort of the resilience factor comes in here, which is the second question you ask is not, are you a good corporate citizen, but is your supply chain going to be resilient to the shocks that are inherent in the system so that you can continue to provide food on the table of people that is sustainable and affordable, right? And one of the things that climate change is bringing to sort of reality for all of us, and to answer Ed's question of, you know, is our current system resilient to it? The answer is not at all, because we're facing shocks at an unprecedented rate, right? The number of, if you just take Brazil in the last year, it basically had record drought followed by frost. It's just like destruction of one crop after another that's happening in sort of ways and at a pace that we don't even fully understand. And food inflation. Nobody used to talk about food inflation. It's the headline of every sort of conversation now. And that is a function of the lack of resiliency. We're only starting to see it. And so I think bringing resiliency into the dialogue becomes really important, because I think there is a great risk. On one side, we're trying to sort of measurably move the world towards good, and we're forgetting that sort of in the next 20 to 30 years, the decisions we made 20, 30 years ago are the things we're going to pay for now. And we don't systematically understand it. So companies like McDonald's saying, how resilient is my entire supply chain to these shocks? And what is my plan A, my plan B, my plan C, is just as important a conversation to have today as a reformer.
So thank you very much. I know that it's the thing to say at COP26 that we're running out of time. We have actually run out of time. So apologies that some of the voices that we wanted to hear in the course of this hour, and particularly to so that the many, many people joining us online, we haven't had a chance to hear. The way ThinkIn works is at the end, the editor, in this case me, tries to say, okay, well, what did we learn? And in this case, using Patrick's example, sample size of 1, here's what I really learned. One was, I think that there is a really, really interesting debate that happened here, not just about chains of command, but around power, right? The power of the purse, the power of the voice, the power to convene coalitions of the willing, but how that actually then translates to government power and to moving, if you like, from one set of buzzwords, science-based targets, to essentially a rules-based system that feels like the really big ask. And then the second thing I'm really struck by is just understanding, better understanding. And, listening to conversation in the room, I'm struck by how quickly we've been overtaken by assumptions and how little we've really internalized data in our understanding. So whether or not that's around both the impacts of different kinds of farming, but also the economics of it, whether or not that's also about just understanding the discrepancies within, markets. What I loved, and this is the one I think I will take away, is understanding simply a difference between supply, the earth, and demand, humans. Two fascinating things to try and understand. Certainly something for us to get on with in the course of the coming 10 days. So with that, I hope you'll join me in thanking Christian Chinsky from McDonald's for joining us, thanking Sarah Maker for joining us, thanking you all for being in the room. But do give Chris and Sarah a big round of applause.